Imagine someone walks up to you on the street and asks you to hurt a stranger. Not badly, just a little. You say no, obviously. Now imagine the same request, but this time it comes from a scientist in a white lab coat inside a university with official forms to sign and a clear explanation that the experiment is for the good of science. What do? Most people answer this question the same way. They say they would refuse. They say they would walk out. They say there is no version of this scenario where they press the button. 65% of them are wrong. In 1961, a psychologist at Yale University named Stanley Milgram set up what would become the most disturbing experiment in the history of behavioral science. He wanted to answer one question that had been haunting the world since the end of World War II. How did ordinary people, neighbors, teachers, fathers, office workers, participate in the systematic killing of millions? The standard answer was that the people who did it were monsters, broken, fundamentally different from the rest of us. Milgram suspected the standard answer was wrong. Here is what he did. He recruited ordinary volunteers through newspaper ads, accountants, postal workers, high school teachers, people with no history of violence, no unusual psychology, no special training. They were told they were participating in a study on learning and memory. When they arrived at the lab, each volunteer was introduced to another person, supposedly a fellow participant. In reality, this second person was an actor working with Milgram's team. The volunteer was assigned the role of teacher. The actor was assigned the role of learner. The learner was taken into another room and, in full view of the teacher, strapped into a chair with electrodes attached to his wrist. The teacher sat in front of a large machine, a shock generator. It had 30 switches arranged in a row, starting at 15 volts and going up in increments to 450 volts. The switches were labeled slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, danger, severe shock, and at the very end, simply XXX. The experiment began. The teacher read out word pairs. The learner answered through an intercom. When the learner made a mistake, the teacher was instructed to administer a shock and move to the next level. The learner made mistakes. The teacher pressed the button. At 75 volts, the learner grunted. At 120 volts, he called out that the shocks were becoming painful. At 150 volts, he demanded to be released from the experiment. At 300 volts, he screamed that he refused to answer any more questions. After 330 volts, there was silence. When teachers hesitated or tried to stop, the experimenter in the white coat responded with a fixed set of phrases. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. No threats, no punishments, no physical force. Just calm insistence from an authority figure. 65% of participants went all the way to 450 volts. Not one of them felt good about it. Many of them sweated, trembled, laughed nervously, begged to stop. One man had a full seizure in his chair. But they continued. When researchers before the experiment asked psychiatrists to predict how many people would go to the maximum voltage, the estimate was about 1 in 1,000. 1%, maybe less. The real number was 65 out of every 100. Milgram ran the experiment again and again. He changed variables. He moved the learner into the same room as the teacher. Compliance dropped, but did not disappear. He had the teacher physically hold the learner's hand against a shock plate. Still, a significant portion complied. He removed the white coat from the experimenter and replaced it with ordinary clothes. Compliance dropped sharply. It wasn't cruelty driving the behavior. It was the labeling of authority. Milgram called it the agentic state. The moment a person stops seeing themselves as a free agent responsible for their own actions and begins to see themselves as an instrument of someone else's will. In the agentic state, the internal moral compass doesn't disappear. It gets redirected. The person stops asking, "Is this right?" and starts asking, "Am I following the procedure correctly?" This is the part that should make you uncomfortable, because the agentic state doesn't require a lab. It doesn't require a white coat or a shock machine or a Yale letterhead. It requires only a system you've agreed to operate inside. Think about every time you've done something you weren't sure about because it was policy, because your manager asked, because the process required it, because everyone else was doing it, and there was a form to fill out and a box to check. Your brain in those moments is running exactly the code that Milgram identified. The code that says, the responsibility belongs to the structure, not to me. I am just following the procedure. Milgram's participants weren't monsters. That's the finding that shook the world when it was published, and that continues to be misunderstood 60 years later. They were ordinary people, caught in an ordinary human process, one that your nervous system and mine are running right now, in offices and schools and systems all over the world, without ever being called what it is. The white coat changes. The machine changes. The labels on the switches change. But 65 out of every 100 people is still 65 out of every 100 people. You read that and felt certain you would be in the other 35.